Prince Harry stood in the witness box not as a symbol, not as a title, and not as an abstract figure of royalty, but as a husband who has reached the end of his emotional endurance. The court was silent as he struggled to contain his tears, and for a moment the legal language, the formality, and the centuries-old rituals of the High Court faded away. What remained was something raw and unmistakably human. He spoke slowly, deliberately, as if choosing each word carried weight far beyond the courtroom walls. And then came the sentence that would echo far beyond that day, that the media had made his wife's life an absolute misery. Not a metaphor, not a dramatic flourish. A plain, devastating assessment of lived experience. This was not performance. This was not strategy. This was the sound of someone reliving years of damage in real time. Prince Harry's testimony on the third day of his legal battle was not simply about unlawful data gathering or press misconduct. It was about the cumulative harm inflicted over decades on his mother, on his former partners, and now on his wife, Meghan Markle. And for perhaps the first time in a British courtroom, the emotional cost of tabloid culture was described not in theory, but in personal, painful detail. As Harry spoke, he described what it is like to live knowing that strangers appear to know intimate details of your life before you have even shared them with the people closest to you. He described the chilling realization that private conversations, holiday plans and personal movements were somehow already public knowledge, reported with confidence, specificity, and intent. That realization, he explained, is not merely unsettling, it is destabilizing. He spoke of vicious and persistent attacks, a phrase that barely captures the relentlessness of what Meghan faced from the moment she entered public life alongside him. He described coverage that was not only invasive, but at times racially charged stories framed to provoke hostility, suspicion, and ridicule rather than understanding. This was not accidental framing. This was not the occasional misstep of a sensationalist press. According to Harry, this was a pattern, one that followed Meghan across continents, across milestones, across some of the most vulnerable moments of her life. And it didn't begin with Meghan. Harry reminded the court that he had seen this before. Years earlier, during his relationship with Chelsea Davy, he watched as another woman he loved was gradually worn down by relentless intrusion. He described how Chelsea felt hunted, shaken by the sense that there was nowhere she could go without being watched, speculated about, or misrepresented. This is a crucial point that often gets lost in public debate. Meghan Markle was not the first woman to experience this pressure in Prince Harry's life. She was the one who came after years of warnings, years of observation, and years of unresolved trauma. Harry made it clear that the consequences of press intrusion are not abstract. They affect how people behave, how they trust, how they love, and how they survive. The courtroom heard how journalists allegedly appeared to possess information that could only have come from private sources, details that were never publicly disclosed, never officially released, and never meant for mass consumption. Harry described the creeping realization that the walls around his personal life were effectively transparent. Imagine discovering that your most private moments are treated as commodities, that your pain is profitable, that your fear fuels headlines, and then imagine being told you cannot speak up. One of the most revealing moments in Harry's testimony came when he admitted that he felt unable to complain about the publisher behind the Daily Mail, not because he lacked the will, but because of the institution he was born into. He spoke of the unspoken rule that governed royal life: never complain, never explain. This phrase is often romanticized as stoicism or dignity. But in that courtroom it was exposed as something else entirely, a gag order that left real harm unchallenged and real victims unsupported. Harry explained that from a young age he was taught that engaging with the press only made things worse. That silence was strength, that endurance was duty. But what happens when silence becomes complicity? What happens when the refusal to respond allows harm to escalate unchecked? For Meghan, that silence came at an enormous cost. Harry described watching his wife suffer while knowing he was constrained by the very system that claimed to protect them. He described the frustration of being aware that lines had been crossed legally, ethically, and morally, while being effectively powerless to intervene. This is not the story of a prince angry at bad press. This is the story of a man confronting the consequences of a culture that prioritizes access over humanity. As Harry spoke, the broader context loomed large. Outside the courtroom, life continued as normal. His father, the king, carried out public engagements across London, fulfilling the duties of the crown with the polished detachment expected of the role. The contrast was impossible to ignore. Inside the High Court, a son was describing how the institution he was born into left him unable to protect the people he loved most. Outside, the machinery of monarchy rolled on unchanged, uninterrupted, and largely unchallenged. Harry's testimony raises uncomfortable questions that extend far beyond his own case. What responsibility do powerful institutions have to those within them? What happens when tradition collides with trauma? And at what point does silence stop being dignified and start being dangerous? For years, critics have dismissed Harry's concerns as oversensitivity or grievance. But the details he shared in court tell a different story, one of accumulated evidence, repeated patterns, and emotional fallout that cannot be brushed aside as personal weakness. The alleged intrusion was not limited to headlines. It shaped how Meghan was perceived, how she was treated, and how safe she felt. Harry described the emotional toll of watching his wife be reduced to a caricature stripped of complexity, empathy, and fairness. This matters because public narratives shape real-world consequences. Hostile coverage fuels online abuse. Misrepresentation invites harassment. Dehumanization makes cruelty acceptable. Harry's voice cracked, not because he was trying to persuade, but because he was remembering. Remembering the nights spent worrying. Remembering the fear of history repeating itself. Remembering his mother, whose own suffering at the hands of the press ended in tragedy. That context hung heavily over his testimony, even when unspoken. The press often insists that scrutiny comes with privilege, but Harry's testimony challenges that assumption. Scrutiny is not the same as surveillance. Criticism is not the same as cruelty, and public interest does not justify private violation. By bringing this case forward, Harry is not only seeking accountability for himself and his family. He is forcing a reckoning with a media culture that has long operated behind closed doors, shielded by tradition and protected by normalization. He made it clear that his uneasy relationship with the press did not begin with lawsuits or public statements. It began in childhood, with cameras at moments of grief, headlines written without consent, and a life lived under constant observation. What makes this moment different is that he is no longer silent. The emotional weight of his testimony underscores what has always been at the heart of this story. Meghan Markle was not rejected because she broke rules. She was targeted because she disrupted expectations. She was attacked because she did not fit neatly into a narrative that the tabloids knew how to control. And Harry, raised to endure rather than confront, eventually reached a point where endurance became impossible. As the court proceedings continue, one thing is already clear. This was not about winning sympathy. This was about telling the truth fully, openly, and without institutional filters. Prince Harry did not cry because he is weak. He cried because the cost of silence has been too high for too long. And for the first time, that cost was laid bare in a courtroom that could no longer look away.